Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à notre session en français. No, that was a small joke because I know we are just before the lunch. We are on the third day of this magnificent conference. So I just want to kick your attention a little bit. So I'm pretty sure that if you are here today, it's because you are both interested into the privacy part of the regulations that each one of us, but also the difficulties that you might have with the growing ecosystem for authorization and all the challenge that you might face for that. So if it's really what moves you, or if you want to learn more about that, you are at the right place. So the drive today will be a smooth drive onto a gravel road, like in Alaska, for those of you who had the chance to go there. It's a common share places in between both of us. So that's why we decided to do that. So we will go through like different elements. We will start by stating a little bit what is the state of the authorization landscape today. We will see what are the problems with that, what we are trying to solve. Like I said, the second part of the talk is to see how we can bind that to the privacy part. So we'll see how the consent management and the privacy regulation are moving things for us forward, and what are also the problems that we are facing over there. And what we will try to achieve is to demonstrate a solution we thought about on how we can try to see those two elements are only the two faces of the same coin, meaning that we can try to kill two birds with one stone by having the right strategy. And for that, we will demonstrate to you how we can move forward with the strategy we think of. Jeremy will have a small demo about that, and we will give you our takeaway for you to be able to apply that with whatever solution and standards that you are using today. Because, yes, you have seen it. I'm Jeff. I'm a senior identity specialist at AWS. At AWS, we have services for managing authorization. We just open sourced one of the language for that. We'll come to that earlier. But the purpose of today is not to talk about AWS. It's really to talk about how you can achieve it. And we hope to give you the mental model to be able to move forward. I don't think that yet.
So hi everybody, I'm Jeremy Ware. I'm also an identity security specialist or architect at AWS. I work with Jeff primarily. So let's get into state of authorization, right? We want to lay the foundation first, and then we'll talk about how we want to address our problem statement. So today, right, when we start thinking about identities, there's a couple of parts that come to it. You have principles. Just for our discussion today, to make it more simplistic, I recognize that principles could be a number of different things. They could be individual users, they could be consumers, third parties, they could be machine-to-machine scenarios. I'm going to address them as users today as it plays into our demo, but just keep in mind, obviously, there's more than just users that represent principles. What we have to do first is define the identities of these principles. Usually that comes with an identity store that may be centralized, decentralized. You may have an external IDP that you use today or a preferred mechanism in order to do that. But what we're really worried about is managing how do we verify these identities, how do they authenticate, and what authorizations or entitlements do they have. So first, your identities are going to be stored in one place. We may be managing their authentication flow through password and username. We may be using passkeys. We may have MFA added as well. And so the principal is first going to go through that authentication method. Following the authentication method, based on information, usually in our identity provider today, we are going to start assigning those attributes or roles or group identities to entitlements, right? And so once the principal has authenticated and gotten, let's say, into your application or into your environment, they are going to then have certain authorizations or entitlements that have already been assigned to them. Where did we start? Right? When we first got started, it was how do they get access over the internet? We had certain standards or predicate of standards that really set the foundation. And those standards were essentially, we needed HTTP communication augmented by TLS encryption. We had strong cryptographic methods that we said are the foundation and necessary in order to prove identity or authentication. But now we've advanced that, right? So we might be leveraging a service like SIG v4 signing for every call that's made to state that this is an authenticated and authorized call. We might be using MTLS, so mutual verification. We're probably all very familiar with SAML, right? Or some of the other standards like FIDO, OAuth, OIDC expansions, right? So that we can verify that the user coming in or the principal coming in is authenticated to a very, very strong degree of certainty. And these are our new identity standards. But once they get in, the problem is then managing their entitlements, right? I believe that you are who you say you are. I believe that Jeff is Jeff on the stage. But how do I manage Jeff's entitlements appropriately? Traditionally, we started with RBAC, or role-based access control, right? So if you are assigned a certain role, for example, a developer role, you should have a certain level of entitlements to access the resources necessary as a developer. But what happened as we started expanding is all of a sudden we start hitting this role explosion because a developer on Team Unicorn may have different entitlements, or we don't want to step on the developer of Team Zombie and what they're doing, right? We don't want this overlap. We want to make sure they're separate. And when we're only managing through an RBAC method, all of a sudden, in order to start addressing the fine-grained authorization problem, we start having role explosion. Right? So I have a role that defines me as a developer. I have a role that defines me on my team. I have a role that defines what I do on that team. And as we try and get narrower and narrower in our fine-grained permissions, one individual might have 30 roles, 40 roles, 60 roles, right? As we scale out to the amount of resources that they should be able to impact, which creates a mess. On top of that, the application, in this example, also has to be aware of every single one of these roles and what they mean, right? Which creates a problem for us. And so what was the next step? We looked at attribute-based access control, which is excellent, right? Now we're narrowing that scope. And so we can start tagging resources and adding tags or attributes to the principal that's making the call in order to decide if you have this tag, you have this permission, which was fantastic for addressing the problem, for example, of dynamic access, where I want a tag that I can add or remove as necessary that will represent entitlements without making huge changes to the back end of my application. But then what happens? We start having millions and millions of attributes because now we want to add a tag for absolutely everything. And we start becoming limited on what we can pass as far as an attribute along in some of the identity standards that we talked about earlier. For example, if I'm sending a JWT in a header, I'm kind of limited as to how much I can pack into that tiny little jot, right? So we start to run into additional problems, right? Application awareness, size, how many attributes we're trying to pass. So what becomes the pros and cons of these, right? A lot of companies think, well, I got to choose something, right? So what's the good of RBAC? It traditionally works great in workforce. I'm going to make some assumptions here, but great in workforce because we have predefined roles. We have roles that are defined in our IDP, and we can carry that over to the application. Fine-grained permission gets a little difficult. We already talked about the explosion of those policies. ABAC and dynamic access control within an application, especially for consumers, this has been a great approach because now we have dynamic access control. I can manage shares of resources across principal to principal and ownership. That becomes really easy, but then, man, I'm right back where I started of I have so many attributes tied to every principal, and my application has to be aware of every single one and how to handle every single one and keep up to date as these change in the ebbs and flows. So what becomes one of the market solutions? PBAC, policy-based access control. Why not take what we've done really well with RBAC and really well with ABAC and mash them together and say, I want to define policies, for example, this one here, that defines, is it a forbid or a permit action? So we'll start with a permit. I want to leverage information about the identity as far as role that perhaps comes over in my JWT or my SAML assertion. And then I want to also augment that control and focus it down, without having a bunch of role explosion, by the attributes that are already coming over to describe that principle. PBAC is also something that we are talking a lot about when it comes to the zero trust strategy. I'm going to throw that buzzword out now, just so we all feel good about it. But what is pushing customers towards zero trust, right? There may be internal considerations, but there are also now a number of external factors. We have compliances. We have executive orders in the United States. We have regulatory recommendations. We have standards like NIST that are making suggestions or setting the bar that customers should reach or should follow in order to manage a very secure infrastructure. So there's a lot more driving behind this than just, we want them to be secure. Everyone's now finding out this is now going to be a requirement. So great, we're all sold. Everyone here is now policy-based access control. That's the only way to do it, right? We're all on board. Perfect. Now, how do we do it? Well, like everything, we have a million different ways to do it. So do we look at centralized? We have a central store. This makes it really great as far as governance. It's great as far as maintaining access and accuracy. I'm not worried about eventual consistency. Well, maybe eventual consistency is okay because I'm more worried about the latency of getting a response to that is authorized call. And so decentralized is the way I have to go, and I need to enforce it immediately, especially when dealing with containers. Maybe I'm looking at distributed. Maybe I have multiple sources of truth with respect to the entities or the principals making the call and in different environments where they have to be segmented. The problem here is I'm going to give you all the quote that we all hate to tell our customers, internal or external, and the answer is it depends. The use case is going to dictate what mechanism you need to use, and with that statement, the use case does not mean this specific customer. They may be leveraging centralized for a majority of their applications and decentralized in other places. And so maintaining the idea that there is no one size fits all becomes extremely important. We need to have those conversations in order to give our customers, internal or external, the best recommendations. So, okay, we've decided. Now, how are we going to manage PBAC as far as we grow out? Right? So we all agree we have to have mandatory access controls. We want to leverage both role-based and attribute-based. We've decided to create policies. But again, now we have a lot of different standards. So we could start looking at some of the advanced identity attempts at creating a standard. There's been multiple over the years. Right? For example, many of us who are in this space may be familiar with Zanzibar, Rego, OPA as a service, right? In our example today, we are actually using Cedar, which was just recently open source, which we'll touch on a little bit later in the presentation. But the point here is there are multiple attempts at a standard. And again, it comes down to what is your use case? Do I need something that processes extremely fast? Do I need something that has multiple options beyond just role-based, attribute-based? I want to add additional context keys as a part of that policy statement. So choosing the language and choosing the PBAC model, centralized, decentralized, all come into place when it comes to making the decision based on use case.
Now that we talk about authorization, and thank you for that, we know that we have multiple places that we can look at our strategy. We can see that there is also a problem with privacy. We had a lot of privacy laws that are coming in. I'm French. I'm coming from France. I saw the enforcement of GDPR. I immigrated in Canada. I saw the enforcement to those Canadian companies that were dealing with personal information of European citizen and resident to have to deal with GDPR. And now we see all those extra legislation coming in. South America with the Brazilian LGPD. In Canada, we are very peculiar. We have one privacy regulation per province, and we will have soon a federal regulations that will come onto that. And we are a little bit different that in the US in the sense that each province is considered a country within the country. So even moving data from Quebec region to the Albertan region, for example, it's an extraterritorial processing. So we have to deal with all of that. And so what can we retain from all those different privacy regulations? It's one single sentence that get with me every time I have a customer conversation, is that I just have to ensure that only the principal that have a justified access, because that's the core mechanism. Steve Wilson was telling that privacy regulations are not forbidding you to do things. They are only saying that you have to do things if it's necessary, and here is the process to vet it. Okay? So only have justified access to personal information must have effectively access to it. So now you see it into the definition of the privacy regulation. We are touching back to having access to authorization. So everything that Jeremy was talking about now makes a sense inside the privacy space of the problem. And one of the issues that we saw on the market is that when you are looking at all the guidance which is provided to you on how to deal with those privacy regulations, they are focusing on two elements. The first one is consent management, mostly consent collection, because that's great. As soon as the user gives me consent, I'm safe. I no longer have to look at it. Okay? So for me, the way that it represents is that each time I'm clicking on I consent box when reading news or anything else, I expect it to be printed out by the printer somewhere into an office and going into a shredder after that. Okay. In fact, it should be used after the fact it has been printed, but not used in the way that it is put into a binder into the 30th basement level of some library and not being looked at anymore. No, we need to use it every time. The other part which is very interesting is the data processing impact assessment, because the data processing impact assessment force you to look at the data processing and what are the risks and what are all the elements that you are putting into place to mitigate those risks. So those are great, but those are just the emerge part of the iceberg. There are far more things that you need to do to be in compliance with those privacy regulations. So let's take a look at it. So the first question that I have is that, do I have to keep the data or not, the personal information? The only way I can know that is that if I'm looking at the authorization part, and if there is still an authorization, a consent which is active, yes, surely I might need to keep those information. But if there is no active obligation to keep it because there is no authorization for whatever human or a system, I might not have to keep it. Who has access to what? Directly related to access control. Who did access what? That's important. That's the first question that the regulator will ask you. Okay, you got a data breach. PI was involved into that. Who did access to what? So the ecosystem that gave the access to the information, the authorization part, will have to play a role into that. Who did consent to what? That's true. Yeah. Bob did access to the PI, but did Jeff consent to that? We will have to answer those questions. How do you prove that Jeff effectively consented to that? So if I'm looking at the authorization source of truth, then I will have the ability to answer those questions. So you see another intervene relationship, close relationship in between the authorization part and the privacy part. So how much consent differs from an authorization policy? As far as I know, in order to have access to some PI, I need both a consent to exist and an authorization rule to evaluate to hello. So that's so much. Consent is scope. You can only read the date of birth. That's true. An authorization policy is just like putting a scope onto one principle can do against data. So again, they are very alike. A consent is time-bound. An authorization can be, there is life cycle for that. You leave an enterprise, you lose all your access to information. So we find it more and more. So again, we are seeing a relationship in between that. A consent as a grantor and a grantee. Policy are mostly a grantee because the grantor is hidden. But yeah, we see that they are sharing common threads. So let's see now how we saw that both of them are intervened, how we can try to promote consent as a first-class authorization policy, as a first-class citizen into our system. So just to recap, we say a policy has a grantee and a scope, and the things that we want to add to that is the ability to add a grantor and a time boundary. Yeah, that's complex. We never did that before, right? We did that when we were issuing those OAuth token through the OpenID Connect flow or any other flow of OAuth 2 in order to be able to do that. I have all the information I want. I have the grantor, I have the grantee, I have the scope, I have the time boundaries. Oh, that's great. I also have the integrity assurance. So if you remember, how can you prove that a consent was made? Integrity assurance might play a good part into that. So how can we now expand that to our authorization? So this is a CEDAR policy. I'm pretty sure none of you or very few of you might have read about CEDAR, but I'm pretty sure that most of you can read exactly what this policy is doing. Let's take a look. We have a permit, so we will allow what? We will allow principal from my app, which are data consumers that have a specific GUID, to do some specific action here, process, again, a specific resource, which is a data silo with a unique ID, under some specific condition. Conditions that say, read first name, last name, date of birth, context that get a date, you see me coming. Because we have the grantee, we have the scope, we have the time boundaries. We can have the grantor, we can have the identity assurance as metadata on top of that. And here, we just represented a consent as an authorization rule. Because this authorization rule is only valid in between the not before and the not after. We can keep it as long as we want into our authorization store. As long as it's no longer effective, no one will have access to those PI. But if I need to look at it for governance or regulation, being able to answer to regulators, I will be able to do that. So it has no bad effect, but a lot of good effect into my strategy. So I hope I convince you that this strategy is good, but I just want to make sure of that. So Jamie, can you do like a small demo about that?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeff. So first off, we want to make sure all of this is shareable. So for example, this is all based on an existing open sourced CEDAR policy language, which exists today in GitHub. If you did want to go yourself through the application, we have a separate branch on the main line for Tiny To Do called Timebox that you could access at this URL. But essentially, our demo is going to cover 4 things. First, I'm going to prove to you that lack of policy in a policy store results in an implicit deny. So regardless of role or information that comes across, when we're looking at the authorization on the back end for a user or a principal that's making a call, by default, they're denied any access. Second, we're going to follow in RBAC, or role-based access control example, an attribute-based access control example in the case of a share. And then we're going to do exactly what Jeff was just talking about, and we are going to integrate consent that is time-bound as a part of that authorization decision. And I'm going to show you what happens when consent is present and once it expires. For the uses of our demo, I'm going to try and remind as we walk through, as I assume each of these personas. But these 4 personas are going to represent 2 administrators, a temporary employee, and an intern called Aaron. And so these are the 4 personas that we're going to walk through as we walk through the demo. Thank you. All right. So real quick, I'm going to load the server. I'm running this locally in order to execute the application. What you saw me do on terminal 2 here is copy policy 0 and make that the sole statement or reference for my policy store. So what you see is it's empty, right? This means I have 0 policies.
Can someone tell us if we put nothing into the file, what should we expect? Yeah, deny everything.
Exactly. Yep, implicit deny. So first off, what we're going to go ahead and do is assume the role of Andrew. Andrew was listed as a admin, correct, when we defined that? So let's go ahead and start our policy. We'll assume the role of Andrew. We are now Andrew.
Can you expand a little bit your terminal to the...
Is it too small? Sorry about that. Is this easier to see? Can you guys see my results better? Perfect. All right. So let's go ahead as Andrew, and we're going to create this great new list called secret sauce. And what should happen because we have 0 policies defining access? It shouldn't work, right?
It does not, indeed.
Well, it doesn't work.
Would it tell you, like the way you did the app, would it tell you deny, or would it just not say anything in any list?
No.
No, it should actually result. So let me reload the application real quick. I tried to have some of this pre-listed walking into the demo. So
maybe the Hibernate.
Pretty sure that's what happened.
No.
Actually, no. Error creating server.
That's not good.
I got an idea.
Okay.
Maybe just a stale terminal.
Should be fine now.
Perfect. And we'll reload our zero policy statement.
Yeah. So one thing that you see is that it changed the file and like dynamically it just reloaded from the file. So that's why we will use that as a way to move forward.
All right. So now we are a user, and now when we execute a create list, access denied, which is exactly what we expected, right?
So you might want to talk about this. What is this over there?
Yeah, so while we have an administrative user who's signing in, on the back end, we have a policy store with zero policies of approval. So we all know that that should obviously implicit represent a deny. So when we jump into our application here, and even as an admin, I try and make a custom list, and as an administrator, I should be able to do so. When we look at the authorization decision, it does not matter what came over on the front end of the application. It matters how we're handling authorization decisions on the back end of the application.
So what happened here is that we are doing one single thing. The app is doing an isAuthorize call to the PDP and pass all the context about the principal, the actions that needs to be done here, the create list against our application. And as you can see, pass information about which time it is, and you got to deny.
So now let's go ahead and start manipulating our policy store. Right? Let's start adding policies. So I'm going to load a new file. And just like when we were looking at the Cedar policy previously, it's pretty readable, it makes it easy. Covering these policies real quick, what you're going to see is a simple permit that basically states any principal can take two actions, the create list and get lists, in the application tiny to do. The next policy states that we have a permit of any principal to take any action on any resource under the condition that the resource has an owner, so that must be defined in my entity store, and that the resource owner is represented the same as my principal. Right, so my principal owns that resource. And then the last one states that any principal can take the get list action on a resource under the condition that the principal is either in the resource.readers group or the resource.editors group. Right, so we have a quick RBAC. Principal can take any action on a resource they own. They can take actions of get list or view, essentially, read list, on any resource that they are on the appropriate group for, readers or editors. All right, so we will execute this policy update. Jump back to our other terminal, and we see that there's been an update of the context. And now, as Andrew, I'm going to make the same call to the application to create a list, and I've created the list. So we've assessed against the policies and stated that Andrew has the permissions to create a list. In this case now, we've made that authorization call, and Andrew should also now have access also to edit said list, correct? So as Andrew, I'm going to go ahead and start editing functions or adding aspects to my list.
So you see all those are resolving as a law because Andrew is the owner of the list by itself.
Correct. So just so we can get a simple view and kind of see what happened here, Andrew now has a list called Secret Sauce, and there are certain features of this list that have been added.
As you can see, we didn't give it a full demo, so it's not toggle anymore.
Pretty straightforward. But what happens when I jump over as another admin? Right. So Amina was also listed as an administrator in the application. Now we are acting as this persona. And as an administrator, we might believe on the front end that she should have full access to view lists. But has Amina been added? Have we acted as this persona before? Has Andrew granted any permissions to share this resource with Amina? The answer is no. Right. So what would we expect to happen if I go ahead and do a get list? A deny. There's been no direct share of this resource. Amina has not been added to the reader or editor group tied to the resource, and ergo she is denied access, even as an administrator. Now let's quickly upload a third policy document called number 2, And we are adding two additional statements, or two additional policies, I'm sorry, to this policy store. So policy 3, which permits a principal to take the update list, create task, update task, or delete task on any resource when the principal is specifically in that resource's editor group. So now we have different permissions for reader group versus editor group. We are also adding the ability for admins to take any action on any resource in the application Tiny to do. So Amina is an admin, correct? So what is the expected result now as we jump back to the other terminal if Amina were to try and do get list?
She should be allowed.
Correct.
And she is.
And now it presents. But what if we act as Aaron? Aaron was an intern, correct? So we want to ensure that my policy statement is true, that only administrators or people coming over with that role are able to access the list. So Aaron should obviously get a deny when he tries to access the list. He has not explicitly been granted access as a reader or an editor, and he is not an admin. So Aaron is denied access.
Access denied.
But maybe Aaron has a valid use case to use this list. So if we assume the role as Andrew again, and we're acting as Andrew, and I execute this command, which I'll explain here, essentially I am stating that I am allowing Aaron, as the principal, to access list 0, and I am granting him read-only access. So I'm adding him to resource.readers, correct? That ahead and executes. Now when I come back as Aaron, should I be able to view the list? Yeah. So we would expect that I can. I'll set as Aaron and try and get the list. And what do you know? We can read it. Now Aaron was only added to the reader list, right? So if Aaron tries to edit the list, what should we result? A forbid, right? Shouldn't be allowed. So Aaron's going to go ahead and he's acting cheeky. He thinks he has a really good idea for the list. He wants to go ahead and add a field. But when he does, he's denied. He is not on the editor's list. He does not have access to do that against our policy store. Now, user Kesha is a temporary employee, and Kesha is not an administrator, and we have not added Kesha in any way to our access. So even though Aaron has access, we did not inherently grant access to everyone. We only granted it to Aaron. And so when Kesha tries to access the list, obviously she is denied access. So now let's look at our final use case, and this is where we start getting into consent as part of the authorization decision. I'm going to switch over to Andrew as a persona, and in this case, I am going to share list 0, which is our existing list of secret sauce. I'm going to share it specifically with Kesha as a principal, and I'm going to set a time-bound limit for the validity of this share. And in this case, it's 30 seconds. All right, we've executed it. Now let's go over as Kesha and see if we have the ability to list the resource. Now obviously we just granted permissions, right? So Kesha should be able to execute this, and she can. Now that's fine and dandy, right? We've granted access, but nobody wants the management of going in and out and in and out. And we want to make sure that consent is a part of the authorization choice. So just exactly as Jeff was speaking about earlier, where it should not be allowed before the start time or after the end time, we want to make sure that while this policy may still exist in the policy store, while this share still exists, consent is time-bound. So if consent is revoked after 30 seconds, even though the permission was still defined to share with Kesha, shouldn't we expect that if consent is no longer valid, access is no longer valid? Even with an access share, they should be tied together for this decision, correct? Right. So I'm going to hope it's been about 30 seconds here.
And it
Perfect.
is. And that gives a great additional feedback is that if you want to expand consent for a longer time, you just have to update the policy in question or to create a new policy with a new time boundary, and the other policy will take over this one. Okay. Or if you want to close it, you can create a forbid policy that completely during a time boundary forbid Kesha for accessing, and outside of the time boundary neither the allow or the forbid, and because the forbid is always greater than the allow, Kesha will be able to access to it because those two policies are expired and it's a default deny by default.
And this is now also auditable, right? Because you still have a copy of the policy. The policy hasn't gone anywhere. So that policy still exists. I can see the exact time boundary where consent was approved by the principal in order to share the resource, when it was in effect, and when it was no longer valid. I have that as a record.
Jeremy, quick question. When you do share a list, you're setting metadata essentially. Is that part of CEDAR or is that part of the data model that supports, that's within the application that you're using?
So the time box, which is over here, sorry, the question was for Jeremy.
No, that's okay.
Good. Okay. Sorry. So the time box that we are setting over here is pure CEDAR policy. The metadata are necessary if you want to keep who is the grantor and if you want to have like a signature based that will represent the integrity of the policy for some external verification that this policy was effectively the one requested. But this part is metadata, but this part is not verified into the access. The access is only made through the CEDAR policy.
The important point to note as well is we have a single time box for this example because we're only doing it once. But time box is an entity as far as policy is, the CEDAR policy is concerned, right? So you could have several time boxes to manage separate consents. These are not all on one big list. Each one is individual.
And the time box is an object we decided to create. If you want to call it time guardrails, that's your choice. That does not change the philosophy. We just decided to call it a time box. That's it.
The access control list, the fact that key shares on the list, that's also the policy, or is that outside of the policy?
The fact is in reader is the schema, the entity store.
Yep. So Keyshow was added as a part of the entity definition for the resource, as a part of the reader's list. The policy states, though, that you have to be on that list under the condition that that consent is also valid. And so it also references the time box entity to see if this consent is still valid. And that's why I said what makes this really powerful is not only is consent now a part of the authorization decision, but you have a record of when that consent was active and inactive. All right. Jump back over to our presentation.
You are not in presentation.
There. All right. So what options did we cover? We covered ABAC, right? So we were able to share the list action based on having a reader attribute or an editor attribute with respect to the resource. So in this case, when we executed the command, that Aaron would have access to list 0 based on being added to the reader attribute of the entity for that resource. We also were able to share the list to an intern if we wanted to. This could be scaled out. So I don't have to define the principal explicitly. I could define by principal group. I could define by principal role. Right? I could define all principals as we saw in our policies. So this doesn't have to be one policy for every situation. There is a way to scale these down based on conditions and attributes that can be dynamic and not have policy explosion. We also had the ability to do ABAC with consent, and this is where we added timebox. Timebox is its own entity, which is really important to note here. We are not just saying between the range of this time with respect to now based on your server assessing the current time and date, etc. We have made timebox an entity, so that is referenced as well under the condition. In this case, timebox reader was defined for a certain range, which we made 30 seconds to represent consent. But exactly like Jeff stated earlier, you might have consent of data on your application that states, for the next 30 days you're granting consent. That could update this policy. And now you know that anyone trying to take authoritative action or leverage that data within your application, or for you leveraging that data, whether it be data model or for any other reason, you know as a part of the authorization decision that that consent is active. And if that consent were not to be renewed or to be denied or be removed, it would no longer meet the statement of the condition, even if we have already defined an attribute for that user, because both must be true. So consent is really tied to this authorization decision.
So thank you for the demo. I think it really settled the point on the fact that those elements are really the two faces of the same coin. That's really what I want you to leave with. But if you have still more space for more insights, let's go through additional key elements into that. So the first thing, wherever you are implementing your authorization policy, think with the PARC mental model. What is PARC? It's principal, action, resource, condition, context, depending on who you are talking to. That's very important because as you have seen during this demo and presentation, this is readable easily by any human. I hope that you get a chance to see that. But it's only not humans that we want to make it easy for. We want also to make it efficient for systems to be able to review and enforce, to be able to parse the very large number of authorization rules that you will have to deploy. For example, that's what we are using as a mental model for AWS identity and access management inside AWS. If you are familiar with that, we are celebrating the 12 years anniversary this year. And thanks to this Park mental model, we are capable of managing more than 1 billion calls towards our API. Can anyone give me in which time scale those 1 billion access can be done? Anyone? In seconds, thank you. 1 billion calls per second. Okay, so if you think about that, you can have a very efficient system that can allow you to do the same things that we are doing. We succeeded into it. You should be able to do that. The second point that I want you to leave with is that policy, authorization policy, you must think about it in 3 spaces. The first space is that the application owner can define what are the capabilities that can exist inside the application. They will express that as code. It will be part of the creation of the artifact as part of the CI/CD pipeline. That's great. The second most important point is this one, the security policy, the guardrail. Like we said, the forbid policy take over any allow. So security will be able to say, as part of the CI/CD pipeline, those are the policies that we want us, the security that no one can cross over. Those will be mainly forbid guardrails. That's great. And the third one that we want to talk to you about is that you can start to think about end users policy. Policies that can be defined at runtimes. So the line of business will say, yeah, you can share. The security will say, you cannot share outside of the organization. End user will say, I'm Jeff, I want to share with Jeremy. That's the 3 kind of policies that you will see inside your application, and all the ways that you are deploying your application should always allow those kind of features and capabilities. Third point, bake scope and time boundaries into your policies. You have done that before, like I said, for the auth to flow, and you can now map element of the auth to flow, element of the API request, like the method, the URI, the resource, and all of that. You can use that to map against those policies. And that's super easy because the developers talk the left-hand side and the security talked the right-hand side, and both can agree onto the same language and the same taxonomy. Okay? You will be able to unblock capabilities, things that you try to achieve and you were not necessarily successful so far. The first part is the ability to review entitlements through graph, because now you can represent, and I have a friend over there that has a very good solution for that. You can review all those authorization policy. Yeah, thank you, Alex. You can have all those authorization policy represented to you as a graph, and it's far more interesting on how to review all of those, because it's graphical. It talks even more to humans. But the next step that I want you to unlock is the ability to be able to generate proof of consent. And we have a good specification for that. The Conformance initiative, if you saw, I'm a sponsor of that. The Conformance initiative has an RFC for the delivery of consent, proof. So you will be able to establish that. Jeremy was talking about it. We can audit directly from the actions that are performed against the policy store, but also from the content of the policy store. Finally, try CEDAR. It's open source. Okay, so we are providing you SDK, documentation, example, blog post on how to do that. Here is a playground you can play with. You don't even have to deploy anything. You will have a sandbox where you will be able to do your stuff. Try it and give us feedback. We are waiting for having your voice on the next features and how you should make this evolve. We are looking for a community to be able to help us maintain it and making this evolving.
There are several samples available on that GitHub repo as well. for you to pull down if you want to play around, like the tiny to-do we did today, as well as several others. So if you don't necessarily want to start from scratch just to try it, you can actually download one of those samples, run it locally like we did today, and really experiment.
Yeah, exactly. Everything that Jeremy has done today, I should be able to do it with any of you next year at Identiverse 2024 in ARIA Hotel here, same place, same time. So next thing is try to learn more. My motto is learn, leap, lead. Do that. We have a lot of blog posts. We have a lot of elements like the AWS community builders that can allow you to be part of this ecosystem and to evolve into that. ID Pro is a good part. We have also equivalent elements that can allow you to move forward. So thank you all for attending today. It's time now for questions. I don't know how many time we have.
We have a couple minutes for questions.
Couple minutes. So sure, Mark.
Where does external data play into the CEDAR and CART model? So I have a policy that guarantees uniqueness of data. How does that play into the authorization process?
So if I understood your question correctly, which is for providing the information to see if the policy is applicable or not, which can come from other system. For the moment, you will need to gather this information and to provide it to the PDP for the PDP to do the information. We are open to hear like different statements and different voices. So again, express it if you think that there is a real role into getting all of that. But that's the point for the moment with CEDAR and our own policy engine, which is verify permissions. Sir, sorry, I don't know your first name.
Is there any way to add a custom expression in the conditions, like a wrapper or something?
Do you want to?
So the question was, are there ways to expand the expression within the condition in order to evaluate, to execute like a Lambda for secondary lookup? Today there is not. So there are certain supports for the condition statements that you have within CEDAR policy language today. Like I mentioned and like Jeff has stated, this is an open source product. This is not, no longer a service you're subscribing to by AWS in order to leverage this policy language. We believe in it that much. So if that is something that you think is absolutely necessary, I would highly encourage you to join the community on GitHub and start looking at that, because these are the kind of things that we want to expand out for the policy language itself.
Now, this being said, there is a very large number of operators that are already accessible into the system. We are currently working into making more available through the CEDAR policy language. Darren is with us today. If you want to know more and discuss about that, you can surely do that with him. Andrew.
The time box object, how does that actually instantiate? Is that based on primitives in the CEDAR language? Is that at the runtime?
No, like we said, the time box that was created is a specific entity object. We decided to to add another level of abstraction into our own demo by representing the consent as an object. So it is an entity. It's not part of the CEDAR policy. But everything that we have done should be achievable with just a CEDAR policy. You can just do like a comparison and all of that. We decided to create an abstracted layer of consent as time box because we had other customer requests and we wanted one demo that fits all. So that's why. But it's just one implementation among many
possible solutions.
Yours being the other part of the ecosystem that might exist.
If you have a different way of approaching it with CEDAR, I would love to see that talk next year at Identiverse.
Any other question? Final thoughts? Yeah, sure.
So, what's going on with CEDAR? I know it's the AWS industry, but there's other worlds out there, GCP and Microsoft, all over the place.
Yeah.
How is that connectivity happening, if it's happening at all?
First of all, it's no longer ours.
Yeah.
It's open source now. We are just one big contributor to that, like any of you can be.
I was going to say, we kicked it off, right? But that contributor list is not solely expected to only be people from AWS going forward. We're not intending to say, hey, it's open source and we're controlling it. We believe in this policy language and the structure of this so much that we said now that we've built what we think is fantastic for our needs today, We want to open source this and see how other people could adapt and use and contribute in order to really make this a policy standard.
So for sure, other entity will try to look at it, will try to influence, will try maybe to merge, will try to do a lot of things. Only history will tell. We just have to write it.
And to that point, I mean, there may very well be other entities out there, even companies, who have decided we're going to offer a solution built on Cedar. Absolutely. Please do. They're not subscribing to AWS to use the policy language, right? So the intent is for this to become something that becomes a standard and a norm to use Cedar. If you have more questions about the language, just because we are kind of hitting time here, if anybody has any additional questions or wants more information, we will be right outside. Please feel free to grab our attention.
Please, before you leave. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before you leave, and few speakers told you that, but within the app, there is a survey about how much you appreciate or not what you saw today. Please, if you can, fill this out, because it will give us feedback to make it better next time.
And for everyone who took pictures, the slide deck should already be available, actually,
Yeah.
if they want to view it.